So let's talk through the most powerful chapters in Warhammer 40k in game right now, and what makes them stronger or weaker. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the strength of 40k chapters in 10th edition, what's strongest, what's weakest, and why. Currently with Codex Space Marines, I feel like there's some very clear power levels, where certain chapters are just massively stronger or weaker than each other in various classes. Then maybe talking about the power of the chapters within those classes gets a bit more interesting, and in particular the thorny question of which is the strongest Space Marine chapter right now might have multiple answers. Let's talk through them though. Space Marine chapters are organised into 3 power levels of in-game strength at the moment, and why I'd rank them where I would. First up, and I'm sure not to anyone's real surprise, in Tier 3 we just solidly have the Deathwatch. The Xenos hunting Space Marines just took an absolutely enormous blow when they were folded into Codex Imperial agents, both in terms of their unique datasheets being excluded from the Codex and put in Legends, the awkward separation from the more mainline Space Marine Codex, but in the context of that they didn't really get many improvements to their actual datasheets, and as a result are pretty solidly the weakest way to play a Space Marine army right now if you're building around their units and using only Codex Imperial agents and allies. It looks like their tournament win rates are around about the sort of 30 to 40% mark, though to be honest I think that the data is kind of meaningless as pretty much no one's taking Imperial agents to competitive events so far. The faction is just not really seen as one that's going to be competing against the top armies of 40k right now, and for those people who are being brave enough to run them, the vast majority are going with the Imperialis fleet as it just has the most value as a detachment overall, and no one's running the Alien Hunters / Deathwatch detachment. For actual units in their codex, they're limited to just 4 datasheets now. The Corvus Blackstar still feels a little bit on the niche side for its overall damage and defense, and it really is the Deathwatch kill teams plus their supporting characters, maybe jumping out of Imperial Rhinos, that really needs to carry the entire power of their army as it stands currently. I feel like both the kill team and the characters are okay. Free stratagems from the Watchmaster, lethal hits from Artemis, and some genuinely interesting enough damage profiles on the kill team that can make a mess out of medium infantry. But just between those 3 units there's just not really enough to carry the entire army, and Imperial Agents doesn't really make things particularly easy for them. Lots of issues of its own, and arguably the Blackspear Task Force got weaker versus the rest as well, losing things like the Tome of Ectoclades and the big damage buff that it could bring. For the Deathwatch in particular, they've basically got the awkward choice of having access to proper numbers of Deathwatch units and their unique detachment rules, or being able to use the main Space Marine range and then fielding Deathwatch as allies, and basically you can't do both when put together, so whichever one you choose you are losing a fairly vast amount of options and theme. Beyond that, the overall Imperial Agents book really struggles with anti-tank, literally 0 dedicated units that can do that well outside of Allied Knights, and for some reason they didn't get in a primary faction rule if you actually filled in them on their own. Games Workshop just printed the Allies rules and didn't give them an overarching thing for if you filled in them as their own army, unlike literally every other army in the game. At the moment I'd say it's fairly safe to put them as single weakest army in the game currently. Apparently Games Workshop are going to have some sort of digital patch or index rules coming for them in December. The idea being to make Deathwatch playable as a more company-level force once more, as it felt like folding them within Imperial Agents kind of felt like it was aimed to reduce them to just fielding a few small kill teams, as opposed to really being a Space Marine army sub-faction in its own right. I guess we'll see what happens with that. Prior to the Agents Codex dropping, they were actually having a little bit more success at tournaments, with some cheaper kill teams and Watchmasters and things. Before we move onwards and upwards, I'd just like to give a shout out to today's video sponsor, Tabletop Stronghold. They're makers of purpose-built magnetic carry cases, a fairly popular way to transport miniatures in 40k these days. The idea being that you have magnets stuck to the bottom of your bases, and then you put the miniatures on trays so they're not sliding about at all, or rubbing on each other during transport, and it reduces the need to carefully pack them away on foam and things. You certainly can make your own magnetic cases, though there's some appeal to having something really custom built. Their cases are made out of MDF, which does mean the cases need a little bit of assembly and they can be a little heavy, but it makes them notably sturdy and should keep miniatures really safe. And then they basically have steel trays that you can slide in and out at different levels to customize the heights that you need, and you have the miniatures magnetized to them. Unlike a bunch of other carry cases out there, they also come with quite a nice clear acrylic panel at the front, so you can basically see your miniatures as you transport them. It's kind of nice to have them a little bit on display as well, as you're going about transporting them, as opposed to just sitting in the box out of sight. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description in any case. The vast majority of the reviews and feedback I've seen about them tends to be really positive, and I'll cycle back to talk about a few of their specific mag cases at the end of the video. Moving on to stronger Space Marines though, and it's probably only in this video that the core Codex Space Marines will be on the middle tier. Though certainly argue despite their problems of being heavily overshadowed by the Divergent chapters, they're still far more credible as an army to put on the table than the Deathwatch right now. Despite that though, when looking at the tournament win rates for the core Codex Space Marines, they are one of the other single lowest ranked codexes in Warhammer 40k right now. Win rates only around about 40%. And despite always getting at least a fair few players doing their best to make them work, they've only won 3 big events since the last balanced data slate, and while there's still plenty of people putting them on the tabletop, it's far less than normal for them. Often core Codex Space Marines tends to rank around about the top 3 or top 4 armies, provided they're at least in some way balanced. For detachment strength for the army, several things can work okay. It tends to be Gladius, Firestorm, Ironstorm and Vanguard that tend to see the most play and have most success in events, all of which do have their own advantages and disadvantages. Ironstorm certainly lost a whole load of ground in the last update though, when they nerfed several of the enhancements and one of the stratagems. Within Codex Space Marines, the units contained aren't awfully balanced compared with plenty of times in 40k's history. There's at least good excuses to put the vast majority of them on the board, even if some things are still overshadowed. Maybe for some of the most common things to turn up in competitive lists, things like Scouts, Infiltrators, Jump Intercessors, Gladiator Lancers, Land Raider Redeemers, and Eradicators might get particular shoutouts. Though depending on the exact detachment and the exact army that you're running, there's far more than that that's very usable as well. The issue is, as ever with core Codex Space Marines, that the Codex chapters only really have their named characters to sell them, versus the Divergent chapters that both get powerful detachments and their own cast of characters and other unique units. So it just means that from a purely army list optimizing point of view, unless the core Codex characters are ridiculously strong, they're just going to be outcompeted by their fancy brothers that do things a bit differently. Hopefully Games Workshop will decide to try and right the scales a bit more sometime in 10th edition, but so far that's just not really been the case. Within Codex Space Marines though, there's 6 different primary chapters, and their strength and temptation to play them is generally just based on their epic heroes. I'd argue that these 3 have it worse than the rest right now. I'd say literally all of their named heroes are usable, but these ones maybe just don't have significant more utility than what you can get from the more generic picks, or at least not as much as some of the other chapters. White Scars only have Corsaro Khan, not awful as a 70-point character with a melee damage buff, but not a game changer, and the themed Stormlance detachment with the mounted keyword buffs is far better for Space Wolves. The Imperial Fists have Lysander, Torgaradon, and Pedro Cantor of the Crimson Fists. Lysander makes Terminators a bit tougher and is a big melee threat. Torgaradon is okay if you know that you're fighting against vehicles, and Pedro Cantor's a solid generalist, though he does lock out the other 2 as he's a different chapter. I'd say all of them are merely good for their points cost, but not great. Their themed Anvil Siege Force rarely sees play as well. It can do okay casually if you're playing with some very sparse terrain and it's a big shooting gallery, but on more competitive, close-range layouts, units are far less likely to be able to just sit and shoot, and important gunline things might just get focused down if they try. Finally for these 3 we've got the Iron Hands as well. Ironfather Phyros is okay. He can make something like a squad of heavy intercessors incredibly tanky at the same time as healing and buffing vehicles, so does need building around a bit, but I've not seen many people trying that out in too much earnest in tournaments. Their Ironstorm Force is one of the more popular detachments, but no longer seems to be winning tournaments anywhere near as regularly after the nerfs as mentioned. For the more mid-tier chapters of mainline Codex Space Marines, I'd rate the Salamanders and Raven Guard here, both of which have characters that I think are interesting enough that they really do something pretty different for their armies, and maybe have a bit more scope to change a game overall. For the Salamanders, they've got 2 pretty good ones. Vulcan Hestan to allow you some big rerolls with your Melters and Flamers, really nice in combo with certain units like Infernus Marines or Land Raider Redeemers or Eradicators versus enemy infantry. Plus he can deliver that buff while being a big objective control presence with some company heroes perhaps. And Ajax Agaturna's got a scary damage 3 hammer. He's legitimately fairly fearsome with Blade Guard, Ashva, Land Raider Redeemer or an Impulsor maybe. Their Firestorm Force is kind of fine as well, does alright for Space Marine transport and shooting shenanigans. I feel like it's generally been the one that people do okay with occasionally though, as opposed to being the headline act for Space Marines as the others have all felt at their times. For the Raven Guard, Kayvon Shrike is the only character that they have, but I feel like he's unusually impactful as he gives potentially a big squad of 10 Jump Intercessors or Vanguard Veterans lone operative style protection, so you can't shoot them at range, and with a fast moving and fairly dangerous unit that could make them really disruptive to deal with. Pretty likely to get the first strike on the enemy as opposed to the other way around. Their themed Vanguard detachment is again one of the better ones, though seems to be more often pinched by the Ultramarines as it works really well with their characters. Speaking of which, out of the 6 major chapters within core Codex Space Marines, the Ultramarines are certainly the ones that have had the most tournament success. They do get more characters than any of the rest of them, with 2 of them in particular being kind of standout good. Marnie's Calgar is just a really strong datasheet all around for his 185 points. He generates command points, has big mobility buffs to a dangerous unit, and can make a scary squad of Space Marine aggressors or Blade Guard into a bit of a Marine Death Star style unit. Adding his Victrix guards and his own damage profile into the mix really takes them to the next level. He's strong in plenty of lists, and lots of people have often used him in Ultramarines Vanguard, infiltrating up the board with an attached Apothecary Biologist. Uriel Ventris is maybe the other most competitively played one, literally just because he grants deep strike to another Space Marine unit that doesn't have to be the one that he leads, so he can be a cheap fighty character with some Assault Intercessors or a Company Hero squad. And then you could have some Fire Discipline Hellblasters or Eradicators dropping down in the Gladius Task Force, or do his Warping Centurions thing in the Vanguard detachment, giving them the Deep Strike keyword and then bouncing them on and off the board with the stratagem, basically meaning that you get their enormous firepower without having the downside of their bad mobility. Beyond that, I'd say that Chief Librarian Tigurius is really quite usable, just lots of value for his points cost, even if he doesn't really combine with the units that he leads quite as well as the previous 2. And then Gilliman and Cato Sicarius I think are both a bit overcosted for what they bring right now realistically. Neither of them completely unusable, but far more rarely appearing in competitive lists, particularly when they've got Calgar and Ventris to compete with. Finally, the themed Gladius Task Force is one of the stronger Marine detachments. It's got good mobility buffs, a nice melee stratagem with the Lance keyword, reactive moves, and the Fire Discipline combo that you can do. Very scary to have both sustained and lethal hits going off on a 5+. It's being used to very good effect by the Dark Angels right now, and seems to be working well with their units to make them one of the strongest armies in 40k. Speaking of which though, and that gets us on to the tier 1 of Space Marine chapters, and after several balance passes, I'd say that the Space Wolves, Dark Angels, Blood Angels and Black Templars are close enough in power with their top builds that it doesn't really make sense to separate them on different tiers, though I think that literally every single one of them has important nuances that caveat when they're strong and when they're not. Out of the 4 of them, I'd probably rate the Black Templars as the lower end of the group right now. They've got slightly lower win rates, play rates, and tournament performance. They were still a very solid army in Warhammer 40k overall. If I had separated out this tier though, I would likely have put them a little bit behind the other 3. For the Space Wolves, they have easily the best tournament win rates, but are generally considered to be a little bit less likely to top grand tournaments and things due to a bit of a skill ceiling with them, and their strongest lists tend to put a ridiculous amount of Thunderwolves on the table, so you might not have quite as much success if you're not spamming those maximally. The Blood Angels have just been fairly strong all around, both in terms of tournament wins and general players' win percentages and things, that they're currently in a bit of a state of hold at the moment, awaiting their final Codex points and seeing the impact of that when they get their rules out and about on the competitive scene. And then Dark Angels are an interesting one, a sort of middling win rate for the average player. But if looking specifically at people using their Gladius Task Force with their strongest army builds, that gets far better, and they've been winning loads of big tournaments with that. I feel like out of these you could possibly argue them to be the single strongest at the top level of 40k. Focusing on these one by one, first up we have the Black Templars. Current tournament win rates are around about 49%, very well balanced in the scheme of overall 40k, and an enormous jump between these guys and the core Codex numbers. They've won 4 big events since the last balanced data slate, though interestingly their numbers do seem to have petered out a bit in terms of how commonly they're played at the moment. They initially started the edition really quite strong compared with the other Space Marines, though have gradually had more nerfs applied to them. It seems they're currently one of the lesser played factions in the game, around about the 23rd out of 26 factions at tournaments. I guess their player base isn't exactly enormous, but it's still a little bit less than I might have expected. For the detachments used, it tends to be their standard Righteous Crusaders, often getting the Feel No Pain type save from the vows that you can swap out for melee buffs if it makes more sense as per the matchup, and then that's supported by some nice melee tricks, in particular having the chance to lock enemy units in melee, get extra AP when they're needed, and flexing out one vow for another, say leaning into Anti-Psyker if you need to. After their enhancements, the Ten Houses Bones is particularly stand out as well, potentially making one Crusader squad into a ridiculous anvil of a unit with a massive 5+ Feel No Pain, and you can potentially have another similar unit with Grimaldus and his buff as well. After the repeated points updates they've had, basically every single one of their units is really quite playable and strong. The Primaris Crusaders seem to be coming to the fore as one of the main ways that people get success out of competitive Black Templars right now, often in big 20 strong blocks supported by characters, giving you enormous units that are a big headache for the enemy to take down and need a lot of focus fire, particularly with Feel No Pains and Armour of Contempt on the go. Helbrecht costs a few more points than he used to, but is still an enormously fighty chapter master, and paired with a squad of Sword Brethren, there are a few targets in 40k that they can't take down in a single round of combat. The Emperor's Champion is a cheap and very fighty beatstick character, hard to go wrong with a bunch of damage 3 attacks at his points cost. As mentioned, Grimoldus can give some really big buffs to big Crusader blocks, and their unique tanks can have plenty of appeal as well. Impulsors in particular are better for Black Templars than elsewhere, bolting on a multi-melter just makes them far more threatening. After several rounds of balancing though, I feel like the Black Templars generally have a lot of options that are merely quite strong for the cost as opposed to stand out great. It does seem that quite a lot of the strongest lists out there are really wanting to build around big blocks of Crusader units, which not everyone necessarily wants to do in-game. They can take a lot of time just to move around the board, roll feel no pains and all those chainsaw attacks, and you can't really afford not to either, as that's where a whole load of the damage comes from. Next up, we've got the Blood Angels, which are the army with their Codex releasing this week. Win rates before the Codex of 53%, 10 big events since the last balanced data slate, and currently really quite a popular faction, placing around about 10th out of the 26 factions in terms of tournament play rate, so pretty strong all-around numbers on every single level there. Their actual Codex still hasn't hit tournaments and things due to the points cost for it not being out, so before then it's been the Sons of Sanguinius detachment though. Massive damage boost on the charge with the +2 strength and +1 attack, Red Rampage for both lance and lethal hits, which can have things like jump intercessors, take down a bunch of normal sized targets in Warhammer 40k, never mind any other sort of scary melee troops, and it seems that broadly that detachment is pretty much getting a flat buff in the new Codex. There's a few trade-offs, and Red Rampage gets a bit worse, and there's a bit of loss of movement support, but they still get the same powerful core rule. They've got a single-use Fights First enhancement, which seems absolutely enormous for countering melee units, and they also gain access to advance and charge as well, which is huge. It seems hard to see how they could go too far wrong, with abnormally dangerous melee units that have the potential to charge extra far when they need to. For pre-Codex units, it was often all about the Death Company with Lamatis or Chaplains to lead them. That might change a bit given that they can't take Mass Power Fists or Inferno Pistols anymore. We'll see how the points shake out for the new version of the Death Company. The Sanguinor was often in attendance with his big heroic intervention and lone operative shenanigans. Captains and sanguinary priests supporting either intercessors or jump intercessors, Bile Predators, and Dante and Sanguinary Guard being pretty usable pre-Codex. Lots of those units have changed for better or worse, and some options have been removed in the Codex. I guess we'll wait and see exactly what the points cost shows for how strong the units will be. I can't help but think that Games Workshop might put the points cost at least fairly high to be kind of safe for them, but even if that were the case, I feel like even just core Codex melee options are going to get them quite a long way with those kind of detachment rules. I'd find it very hard to believe that Blood Angels are going to be weak after all this. Next up, we've got the Dark Angels, who might have more middling win rates for the average player of 51% or so, but this kind of hides the fact that they are possibly the strongest way to play Space Marines in 40k at a top tournament sort of level. Their Dark Angels Gladius has win rates are around about 55% or so, and their numbers just brought down by people playing the Inner Circle task force to try and make their Codex work. And the Sons of the Lion have been clearing up the big tournament wins, 11 big wins since the last balanced data slate, and the single most popular of the Space Marine chapters in terms of people taking them to tournaments, 7th out of 26 factions, lightly buoyed up by the recent model releases that they've had a fair bit. The Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions broadly went down pretty well, so it might be kind of motivational for people to put them on the table now they suddenly got very strong, or working out to Games Workshop's advantage, I'm sure, a bit there. As mentioned before, it seems to be the Gladius task force that's working out really well for those units. The Dark Angels Codex attachments just released kind of weak, and despite both Unforgiven and Inner Circle both getting a buff in the last balanced data slate, it seems to have been absolutely nowhere near enough to narrow the gap. If you are happy to go with the Gladius though, you can get Advance and Charge and Lance. Access to Advance and Charge and access to the Lance and AP stratagem for their Deathwing Knights and the Inner Circle Companions are both pretty enormous. Plus you can also have a Fire Discipline combo on the go. The fashion seems to be for a bunch of Eradicators in a Repulsor these days. A pretty fearsome little force that should be able to just demolish a bunch of enemy armour or potentially elite infantry if needed. For their strongest units, Azrael is pretty much always in attendance. Farming command points and getting an invulnerable save and a damage buff is rather excellent. He could lead some Inner Circle Companions or maybe some Hellblasters or something, though it seems he's most popular just with some Assault Intercessors, providing him a bunch of bodies and some nice rerolls. The Inner Circle Companions themselves, though, are popular, often with a Judas here, a dangerous fights first threat that's got enough damage to put the majority of enemies off charging them. They can heroic intervention and could be a good choice to transport into battle with impulsors. Deathwing Knights are just all around scary, massive damage and massive defense, and Gladius helps them actually reach combat. They usually have no characters alongside them, and can either foot slog or rapid ingress to get them to the fight. And there's some use of the Primarch himself as well, Lionel Johnson is a big points investment and needs to be played with kind of carefully, but at the same time he can be a massive problem for certain armies out there, posing the question of how do you deal with a great big 3+ save, high toughness target with fights first that you can't even shoot unless you're within 12 inches. Just crazily dangerous to approach for a bunch of melee armies, and lots of things also can't afford to charge him. Overall, it's far nicer to see them actually using their melee elites and the Primarch himself not being unplayable, though it would be nice if their Codex detachments were more credible alternatives to the Gladius task force. Finally though, and ruling the roost in terms of tournament win rates are the Space Wolves. They're winning around about 56% of games at the moment, so pretty scary with their optimised lists. Only 5 big event wins since the last update, though even that isn't too terrible for the amount of people playing them. They're played way less than say the Dark Angels, 20th out of the 26 factions in 40k. I'm sure they're being a bit more than usual due to their good army strength, but I think they just don't have that many collectors at the moment, given that they're pretty much widely expected to have a Primaris update, with a good chance of it coming later this edition. And if you want to field their strongest army list right now, their best theory lists tend to build around ridiculous amounts of Thunderwolves, which not everyone wants to go out and buy. In general, for their performance, they seem to be perhaps the single strongest in terms of just overall strength for the average player, as shown by having the best win rates, but maybe not quite as good at some in terms of actually winning tournaments, a little bit limited at the absolute highest levels of play, due to a bit of a skill ceiling with throwing Thunderwolves at the enemy and keeping their army in wolf jail. But I'd argue that isn't exactly a big deal for the vast majority of players out there, given that most people aren't fighting for the top spots of grand tournaments on a daily basis. For their strongest attachments, they currently have 2, the Stormlance and the Champions of Russ. The Stormlance really is the one for mass Thunderwolves. Advance and charge is really handy for them, and plays in pretty well with their character buffs. There's an enhancement that can allow first turn reserves arrival, even with rapid ingress, which is pretty nasty. And then stratagems for massive durability at range, boosted melee damage, and plenty of other interesting movement things. Reactive moves or super long advances and charges could be absolutely game changing. Otherwise though, it's really nice to see that the Champions of Russ is actually playable as their themed attachment once more. You now get to start with a saga, so you could have whole army feel no pain or melee damage of some sort. And then if you unlock other sagas with character actions, it's a feels good bonus as opposed to just limping into getting your army special rule on turn 2 or 3 or something. That's just got generally good support for melee armies, an extra AP stratagem, flexing into different sagas as you need them, and stratagems just generally getting more if you can activate those sagas army wide. As mentioned, it tends to be their Thunderwolves that are the absolute strongest units they have. They've got good damage, defense and speed, and make their characters extra fighty on the charge, and you can go as heavy as you want into them up to the maximal unit caps. Beyond that, Wolfen are still very nice, really good stats for the cost even if they don't have any objective control. Logan Grimnar's pretty powerful with some big melee rerolls that apply army wide, and beyond that maybe Bjorn and Murderfang stick out a bit more than some of the others, though they've got plenty more datasheets usable. Overall seem to be in at least a pretty good place by chapter standards. Maybe it's not the best thing for the chapter as a whole if one of their very strongest builds is spamming out quite that many Thunderwolves, but it's not like there aren't other ways to play them, and it's pretty good that their themed attachment is powerful enough to consider these days. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your Space Marine experiences recently in 40k. Do you feel like your own chapter's having a good time or bad time in game right now? As mentioned now, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor for Tabletop Stronghold, makers of these custom built MDF carry cases with steel trays for transporting minis in safety. If you wanted to check out their range, their link's down in the video description, and if you use the code TACTICS when buying you get 20% off, as part of their global launch sales which they've been doing over the past month or so. The idea is that they're MDF boxes which have the trays that slot into these grooves here, so you can have them at different heights depending on your army, and then you put magnets on the bases of the miniatures to stop them sliding around and basically transport miniatures in safety without having to scrape them against each other or even against foam. As you can see by the pictures here, you can fit on really quite a lot of miniatures on each one of these trays, something like 30 plus Terminators if they're quite loaded, 6 Knight Armigers, or around up to 90 infantry. You probably wouldn't want to load them quite this full in my opinion. It does kind of show the sort of scale of army that you can get into these things. For the different sizes of them, this is the mini one, a smaller one with 2 trays for maybe a sort of combat patrol to 1,000 point force perhaps. It's still big enough to get things like a Spartan tank and a Sicaran in here, plus a bunch of Terminators too though. This one's £84 or $100 or €100, though there is that 20% off code as mentioned. Then here's the bigger one, the more standard size mag case. This one's really quite significantly taller. This one comes at a price of $165 or £140, but if you've got bigger taller miniatures, this could fit quite a lot here. You can see a Chaos Knight on the bottom for scale here. and I'll put the dimensions up on the screen for the internal space. Then here's the really big one, the XL one, which is basically 2 big cases strapped together. This one's about double the cost of the previous one, though this one is the model that comes with the extra trays. If you had lots and lots of infantry, for example, if you've got fewer bigger things, then you could get away with a cheaper version that doesn't have quite as many steel trays, but this one should be enough for the majority of armies out there, I'd imagine. And as mentioned, you can see them as you transport them with those clear acrylic sheets on the front. In any case, feel free to check them out, link down in the video description if you'd be interested in picking one of those up. A big thank you to them for sponsoring the video, and of course always bear in mind that there's all sorts of other ways that you can transport miniatures about. Lots of cool foam things out there, other magnet cases, or scratch building your own magnetic boxes is all doable too. I think they are quite fun though, and I've broadly heard fairly positive things. In any case though, let me know your thoughts on Space Marine chapter strength down in the comments, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out most days. Otherwise, if you'd like to help support the channel and keep the content coming, I do have a Patreon page as well, linked down in the video description. On that you can see certain videos early, there's occasional votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry to the channel's monthly prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.